Hi everyone, nubkeks here. Welcome back to Nub Raids. At the time you're watching this video, I am hopefully on holiday, sipping a nice cocktail in the sun by the pool. Or in the pool by the sun, who knows? But I'm recording this a little bit ahead of time because they just told us this weekend that not only does the Hydra get stronger, but also weaker, right? There's going to be more heads for Hydra coming. There's going to be higher difficulties coming as well. But before that, they're going to make Hydra a bit more forgiving so that it is easier to do. And yeah, that it flows a bit nicer. So what I want to talk about in today's video is what I think they will change and what I hope they will change. And I also think it's kind of funny. I mean, who knows? Maybe they will have announced what the changes are. And I won't have seen that, and this video will come out, and you can kind of laugh at my predictions if they're wrong, or be astounded if they're right. I mean, it's really up to you, I guess. Well, it's really up to me in terms of making them. But yeah, let's dive in and let's discuss. So the first thing I want to talk about, which I think is the most likely thing they will nerf, number one, is the Hydrostats. I think this is super likely. If you want to see this full spreadsheet, by the way, it is linked in my Discord channel. You can find links to that in the description down below. But there are some pretty striking things when it comes to the stats of these heads. So, for example, if we look at the Head of Mischief, I feel like its resistance scales pretty reasonably. So on normal, it has 60 resistance. On hard, 110. When we go up to brutal, 175. And then on nightmare, it jumps up a good chunk there to 255 resistance. This all seems pretty reasonable to me. That seems pretty fair. And of course, bearing in mind, these heads get plus 50 resistance when Head of Suffering is there. But it's like a reasonably solid progression of stats. When we look at accuracy, though, Head of Mischief, it starts with 250 accuracy. This is on normal. This is equal to several of the bosses at their hardest difficulty of Hard Doom Tower. This is how much accuracy they have. I believe Dark Fae is 250, Griffin, Scarab. Yeah, a lot of them are sitting around this mark. This is a huge amount of accuracy. Goes to 310 on hard, 345 on brutal, and this is hilarious. It goes up by 5 points to nightmare, to 350. That's right, it goes from 345 to 350 between brutal and nightmare. So for me, when I look at this, it just seems that they've massively over budgeted the accuracy for this on these lower difficulties, right? There's no way it should only increase by 5 between brutal and nightmare, and I feel like the nightmare amount is fair. So what that means is we need to go in, we need to reduce brutal, we need to reduce hard, and of course we need to reduce normal as well. And I think this would help a ton, right? This would help a ton with being able to build up a resistance tank much more easily. Like with 250 accuracy, you're looking at 350 to 400 resistance to be able to resist Mischief on normal. On normal, that's just crazy. So that really needs to change. We push that down and a lot of strategies become more open. At the same time, I think another thing they could do if they're going to nerf any of these stats, I definitely think just nerfing the Hydra speeds overall also makes quite a bit of sense. I think that's quite doable. So for example, from Nightmare to Brutal, Head of Mischief goes down 20 speed, but then it only loses 10 speed going down to hard and then 10 speed going down to normal. I think a pretty straightforward thing is applying the same concept as well to all the other heads is to knock them down by bigger chunks of speed between each difficulty. Actually, funny enough, Decay goes down by 10 on each difficulty. It's really Mischief that scales up crazy. Or in other words, it's Mischief that's too fast on the lower difficulties. But you could knock these down, right? Just go to all of the heads and lower their speeds on the lower difficulties. I think that's really helpful. The Hydra heads take less turns. You have to deal with their mechanics less often. It just gives you a lot more control over the fight. It makes it much more forgiving. That is definitely the stat that I would target after accuracy to make this more reasonable. Now, funny enough, guys, I'm flicking through the guide here that they've published in the game, the strategy, and it doesn't seem to say anything about Devour, but the Devour mechanic is definitely point number 2 that I would be changing as well. So obviously the Devour, it's the countdown, the green countdown timer on your dude. So for example, right here, that looks like Whirlum Frost King. It's probably hard for you guys to see. He has 14 turns, I think. Or it's even hard for me to see. I'm pretty sure it's 14 turns left until he is devoured by one of the heads. And then, of course, you go through this digesting period. And as the fight goes on, the countdown timer, the mark of the Hydra, to when you are going to get devoured, that keeps getting shorter and shorter and shorter to the point where past about a turn 100, you start to get devoured very quickly by these heads. You know, they'll be gobbling up your champions left, right, and center. And then the digestion timer decreases as well. I don't know if there's a picture of it right here, but that digestion timer, how long it takes the head to eat you, that gets shorter and shorter each time too. And actually, it caps at 2 turns. You only have 2 turns before you can free your champions. That is definitely something that I think that they could and should change. So, for example, the Head of Suffering. Let's talk about this guy. He has a move that gives him an extra turn. So I'm sure we have all been there where our champion gets eaten by Head of Suffering, and you look and you see, oh, he has his extra turn move. It's going to be off cooldown. So it means that you don't actually have 2 turns to free your champion. You only have 1 single turn, because he's going to burn through 2 turns in a single go. Or likewise, freeing a champion from the Head of Mischief, who you can't target without Hex. When you only have 2 turns to do it, that can be super, super punishing. Especially if you might not have your moves back on time, right? 2 turns is not very long at all, especially when Mischief has so much speed, as we talked about before, and accuracy to steal your turn meter. So I think increasing this Devour timer, even by a small bit, could make a big difference. So I would say capping it out at 3 turns as the minimum it can go to when they eat you, right? I think that's pretty fair. 3 turns digestion, which means that Head of Suffering can't devour you in just 1 single turn. It would take him 2 turns, including his extra turn, right? Because he has to burn through 3 stacks of the consuming your champion buff. That would help a ton, make it much more forgiving. And basically what this would enable you to do, by not only increasing the time it takes between each of your champions being eaten and then the time you have to break them free, it lets you bring less damage. It makes the damage checks less important. You have more time to deal with the Devour, which is the real timer on the fight, which would let people bring in tankier teams, more sustainable teams. You're not as reliant on these big nukers like Royal Guards or Geomancers. You can have a bit more flexibility there. I think that would also open up Hydra an awful lot, as well as cutting out some of those big frustrating moments. The third thing I want to talk about, I actually don't think it's the third most likely. So I'm kind of breaking the rules in my own video here, but I want to throw it in because it just follows so well after the last point. But one of the things I would really like to see changed for Head of Blight, the one that puts poison clouds, and Head of Decay, the one that cleanses and puts the shields out. For those 2 heads in particular, it's one of the most frustrating things to me, which disproportionately affects lower difficulties as well, right? Because on higher difficulties, the heads are much tankier. You don't kill the heads half as much as you can on the lower difficulties. It just doesn't happen. But on the lower difficulties where you do kill them all the time, it's extremely frustrating when a head respawns from being decapitated. And if it's the Head of Blight, for example, let's say one of your champions has just been devoured, and then, oh, hey, guess what? It's me, it's the Head of Blight. I just respawned. Have a poison cloud. He comes straight out and does the poison cloud. Or even worse than that, is the Head of Decay comes in. He pops up and he's like, yo, have a life barrier person that just devoured this, or have a full team cleanse everyone on the team. And it's just very frustrating to actually prepare for it and deal with it, because he just pops out at random from the devoured head. You've no idea which head it's going to be, and it can completely ruin your plans, even to a point where sometimes there's nothing that you could possibly have done, right? You need to use your moves. You need to debuff and try to nuke down a head that's just eaten one of your champions. Then if the Head of Decay pops out and cleanses them, it just ruins your day. So what I would love to see changed is to give these 2 heads a cooldown on their abilities when they spawn in. I think this would do a huge amount to combat that frustration. I actually don't mind any of the other heads. They can all do their moves when they spawn in. But when Head of Decay spawns in, he should have to wait, even if there's just 1 or 2 turns cooldown on his AoE cleanse, and maybe 2 or 3 turns cooldown on his single target shield, just to give you a chance to actually deal with it. Thing number 4 that I would love to see them do is to up the decapitation benefits of destroying these heads. It's something that you probably barely notice, right? You probably barely notice, but for example, when you decapitate the Head of Blight, he's supposed to do a significant chunk of damage to any heads under HP burn debuff. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people didn't know this actually existed. Or the Head of Suffering, he's going to give you a big shield when he's decapitated. The Head of Vengeance, this one is a bit more noticeable. He does a big chunk of damage. He does more damage if he's under the Vengeance buff, so that can be a little bit noticeable sometimes. He also has, weirdly, a 25% chance to put Leech in all heads for 2 turns. It's weirdly low, so this is something that I would really like to see changed. I actually might rate this as the 3rd most likely thing. In other words, really rewarding you in a significant way when you decapitate these heads. I talked about this in a previous video, but I think you can go in and basically amp up all of these effects. Like, the only one that really stands out to me is Mischief, where it fully depletes the turn meter of all the other Hydra heads when you decapitate him. Like, that one feels good and you notice it, and it's awesome. But like Blight, damage to heads under HP burn, like, come on, it's just not there. So tweaking those things up, making them more impactful would feel great, and it would make it feel also more rewarding when you decapitate a head. I think that would be great. It's something they can easily do too. That's not hard to add in. And it just seems to me to be a fairly win-win thing, which again benefits lower difficulties where you kill heads more often. It benefits those more, and it doesn't completely destabilize the harder difficulties. They'll still be almost as hard even if you buff these things up. Then the 5th, and I think the final thing that they might do, I think this is the least likely. I think it's probably the biggest change outside of obviously giving you indications as to which head might spawn in, which is a lot of, I think, technical and coding issues. I think adding in new vulnerabilities to these heads, so just completely changing the mechanics of how they work in a way that makes them easier. So I chose this picture right here is to give one example. If we look at a champion like Romantu Drake's Blood, obviously most people won't have him, but he can increase the cooldowns of targets that he hits with his A1. He can increase their cooldowns on their abilities. It might be kind of interesting, for example, to put that in as a weakness for the Head of Decay. So where is he? My least favorite head, this guy that cleanses your stuff, right? If you could use cooldown increasing effects to push these cooldowns back, that's a pretty big vulnerability to a head which, other than that, really doesn't have any vulnerabilities. His vulnerability really is just playing on manual and saving your cooldowns. It's pretty much the only thing you can do. It's kind of, you can kind of target certain heads to try to bait the shield onto them, but like all that stuff, it's kind of awkward. He just doesn't have much counterplay. So adding in that sort of thing, making him vulnerable to cooldown increasing effects, that could be a fun thing. I think another intriguing thing they could do potentially, they could make Head of Mischief vulnerable to provoke. And I think that gets kind of spicy. If you can actually provoke him up with a high resistance person, or alternatively someone that doesn't have any real any buffs on them, and they could just force him to attack, you could do some spicy stuff with that. You could definitely do some spicy stuff with that, and I think it sort of fits with how it works as well. Just locking him down with provokes. Just adding in these new effects to these heads that makes them easier to counter, gives them these extra vulnerabilities which you can exploit. You can bring in new types of champions to take them down. So yeah, like I said, I think that one requires a lot of work. That's a lot of creative work on the team's part to figure out, would this completely unbalance it? You know, which champions would be affected? What team comps would work now? How does this change everything? It's such a big change. But I think it could be a really nice change, a very fun change as well, because it lets you use more champions. It lets you use champions that you have in ways that you otherwise couldn't. I mean, heck, maybe let us freeze the Head of Decay. Freeze him up. Bring in those Pixneals. Let's have it happen. Could you imagine? Oh my gosh. So yeah, stuff like that I think could be nice. Or even just slightly nerfing their abilities, like changing this away from the Head of Torment, maybe not doing true fears, but just regular fears, so you don't lose out on one of your abilities. There's some stuff like that has some potential, but I think it's definitely, if they were to do it, they should do this slowly and in a limited fashion. So there you go, guys. They are like the big things that I think that they sort of ranked in order of how I think they will change it, and also giving you some thoughts as well in terms of what I would like to see. So I do think that stat changes, stat nerfs on the lower difficulties not only make a lot of sense, but would be very fair, would be a great idea. Actually, let me throw in one final thing. I totally forgot this. Change this. What is this 4-star nonsense? Get this out of here. 4-star stuff is just terrible. It should not be in there. We should be getting 5-star. I mean, 5-star rare gear isn't even good, but at least give people that. Like, come on. At least give them 5-star gear. 4-star gear out of Hydra. That just feels bad. Yeah, there you go. Those are the things I think that could come. Let me know what you think, and thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.